Welcome to our video on making a Coptic binding. Coptic bindings are some of the most fun to make. They're quite simple, even though they look very involved and very kind of ancient feeling. And the original Coptic bindings were actually very old. And I want to show you a couple of different approaches. This type of Coptic binding, and let me zoom in a little bit so you can see this beautiful, almost braided look that Coptic bindings have. I'll show you this one also. These two larger sketchbooks were made using a Coptic binding that is sewn along the spine. So you go back and forth along each set of pages. That's called the signature. And this type of Coptic binding uses only one needle, but it can be a curved needle can be helpful for that. And I'll be showing you how to do that Coptic binding in another set of videos. In this set of videos, I'm going to show you how to do an across the spine Coptic binding, which is all of these smaller ones. Across the spine Coptic bindings are actually the more, I guess you'd call it authentic type of Coptic binding. And again, let me zoom in so you can see that these also have that braided look, and you can mix and match the threads to give it even more texture and more interesting effects. In this one I added beads to each of the knots along the spine, so that adds another element of texture and kind of an interesting effect. These two small books are also completed with Coptic binding, but so are all of these miniature books that are glued to the covers of both of these. And so one of the fun things to me about across the spine Coptic bindings is that they are so transferable to different sized books, and you can change the number of stitches that you do, and as well as their placement to create some beautiful patterns. You can also actually combine across the spine and along the spine bindings to create even more interesting effects. And this one is using a more kind of textured rustic thread, and so that creates another effect as well. Okay, so once you have decided that you want to work on a Coptic binding, whether you are making a large book or a small one, there are several tools and materials that you need. I like to use a rotary cutter. It's actually made for quilting, but it's very handy for cutting paper as well. You can also use scissors, and I should have some scissors laying here too, because they're very handy to have even if you do use a rotary cutter. You also want to have an awl, and an awl is just a very sharp ended pointy tool that you use to pierce both the book cover as well as the papers. You also want a pencil. You want some needles, and in this set of videos I'm going to show you the Two Needle Coptic Binding, and there's a specific types of needles that you want to look for. Okay, you don't want needles that have very large eyes, because if the eye is too large, it will kind of stretch out and enlarge the pierced hole that you have made in the paper and expand it, and so your book sewing will not be as strong. You also, if you can get some that not only have a fairly small eye, but are also somewhat blunt rather than really sharp, that's also helpful, because then the needle will go through the holes that you have already pierced in the papers, rather than being so sharp that they end up making new new holes. So these are often called tapestry needles or cross-stitch needles, depending on the size. So if you're going to be making a large book with kind of large piercings, you can use a larger eyed needle with a blunt tip. If you're making a smaller one, use a smaller needle. And if you're making a really tiny book, you don't really have much choice but to use a sharp needle. You can kind of file it down so that it's not as sharp on the tip. But with really tiny books, I end up just using the needles that I have and not really modifying them. And you'll need 2 of those for the across the spine Coptic binding. You will also want to have a nice measuring device, and if you're using a rotary cutter, you want a plastic one. If you use a metal one with a rotary cutter, not only are you going to be blunting your blade by, when you go up against the metal, but it's also kind of like fingernails on a chalkboard. Those are the main tools, and you also want to have a cutting surface. And once again, I like to borrow from quilting and use just a quilting cutting mat. With bookmaking, it doesn't have to be a real large one. Just one like this works great, and that keeps you from ruining your table. And it also actually has some nice straight edges and stuff that you can use to line things up. For the materials, you want to have some wax, and this is a chunk of beeswax, and beeswax is kind of the traditional choice. If you don't have access to that, you can also use paraffin, and this is just one of those little chunks of paraffin wax that you can put in one of those warmers, and it's scented. This one is scented with vanilla, and so the paraffin works fine too, even if it is scented, and I'll show you how to use that in a moment. You can also use like a soy-based wax if that is more available. Then you want to choose some thread, and I like to use slightly thicker thread. So when I use embroidery thread, most of the time I use the full width of it, which is actually several very thin strands kind of grouped together. But you can also pull these apart and use only one or a couple, or however many. This is a different type of embroidery thread, and as you can see, it's quite a bit thinner, so that's also an option. The color that you choose and the thickness really depends on the effect that you want to create, and the patterns that you plan to create as well. Finally, you will want a couple of kind of stiff boards, cut the size that you need, both the same size, and you can either paint them to decorate. This is very lightly painted. You can kind of see it's a little bit metallic on black. You can also just use plain cardboard, which you can cut from the backs of notebooks. You can cut apart like cereal boxes, things like that. If you're using extremely thin cardboard, it's probably a good idea to kind of laminate them together to make one thicker piece of cardboard, so that it has some rigidity and some strength to it, and then cut it to size after that has dried and you've pressed it so that it's flat. You also want some paper, and you can find some beautiful paper for resumes at various copy centers and print shops and such. You can also just use plain computer paper or notebook paper, anything like that. For most books, you want the grain of the paper to follow the same direction as the spine. And most machine-made paper has the grain running vertically. So if you have a tall sheet of paper, most of the time the grain will be vertical. That's just the way the machine makes it. You can kind of tell what direction the grain is by kind of taking your thumbnail and curving it, and the side that has the grain will not curl as much, but the side that's kind of going against the grain, that's perpendicular to the grain, will curl. So you can see that. You can also tell because it's easier to roll it this direction than it is to roll it this direction. There's just a little bit more resistance. And if you get it wet, you know, if you either spray it with some water or if you wash it over with a brush, usually it'll curl along the grain rather than against it. Okay, although as thin paper is drying, it tends to kind of curl all over the place, but just kind of notice. So if you don't want a really tall book like this, for regular printer paper, you can simply measure. This standard printer paper is 11 inches tall. So at 5.5, and be sure you line this up at the top. 5.5. Always mark your measurement twice so that you can line up your measuring tool with both measurements to make sure that you have it drawn accurately. Draw it across. Double check. Okay, and then you can use your rotary cutter. And what's handy about these quilting rulers is that you can actually line up these lines across here to make sure that that you're cutting square or measuring square. Okay, and different rotary cutters have a different way of activating the blade. Hold it firmly and then cut it. Put the two sheets together, and then to make an even fold, you kind of slide it across, line it up, and then fold it like so. Okay, so that's how you make a signature. When you have chosen your boards, you also want to either have some decorated paper, and this is just some paste paper that I made. You can also use book cloth, and I show you how to make book cloth as well as paste paper in some other videos that you can watch if you'd like to do that. And then I will show you how to glue the decorated paper or book cloth onto your covers later on in this video. Okay, so that is really all of the essential tools and materials that